special guest is Steve Gottlieb. Steve is a graduate of Columbia College and Law School and practiced law for a decade before turning his lifelong hobby of photography into his vocation. As a photographer, Steve has been photographing Washington's architecture, people, parks, and activities for over 25 years. He has photographed and authored 2 widely acclaimed books about America, American Icons and Abandoned America, a book that was selected by both People magazine and USA Today as the 2002 Gift Book of the Year. Today we will look at a revised version of his book, Washington, Portrait of a City, first published in 1985, in which he shares some visually stunning images of our nation's capital. Shutterbug magazine said gifted author and photographer Steve Gottlieb has crafted yet another inspired book, and Popular Photography magazine states that Gottlieb has produced a book of cityscapes that manages to escape every cliche. And the Washington Post writes that Gottlieb shows Washington in a different light. His images of Washington are all his own. Steve founded Horizon Photography Workshops, where he currently teaches, and he's also the founder of Vision Mining, a consulting firm that uses photography-based exercises to promote innovation and team building in organizations. Steve Gottlieb, welcome to UDC Books.
Very good to be here, Cheryl.
Glad to have you here. Now, how does a lawyer for 10 years turn into a photographer?
It's a rather unusual story. I was at the time, after a number of years of practicing law, I became a manager of a division of a corporation, and photography was my hobby. And my favorite subject was Washington, partly because I lived here, but also it just really inspired me. And I took a lot of pictures, and at one point I went into a publisher, and I had the audacity as kind of a corporate lawyer type to present these pictures and asked if he would be interested in publishing the book, and he said he would. And so we set a publication date, and it never occurred to me to change professions, but he created a brochure, the publisher did, to promote the book, and he sent it around town, and that led to a phone call, and somebody asked me to come over and said he wanted to buy some prints from the book that had yet to be published. So I said fine, and then he said, you know, I actually had an ulterior motive in inviting you here. I'd like to hire you to do an assignment. Can you do that? And I said, sure, on weekends. And he said, what do you charge? And I stopped and tried to look like I had thought this through and I knew something, but it was totally an unknown thing. So I blurted out $350. And he said, and that's plus expenses? And so I said, of course, not having any clue about that.
Right.
And then he said, the words, these were kind of the epiphanal moment of my life, to be able to look back and say, there was a moment that changed my life. And he said, I can't do that. Your work is good, and I can't pay you anything less than $500 a day.
Wow.
To which I, of course, said, plus expenses.
Wow.
And he said, okay. And I walked out of his office, and I thought, my goodness, I could have asked for $750. People would pay me to do what I love. And it's kind of surprising because for reasons we might have a moment to get into later, I was raised in a family with a lot of photography. My father was a part-time professional photographer, but it had never entered my mind until that very minute that I could actually make a living.
So let's go
I mulled it over, by the way, and when my book actually came out, I handed it to the chairman of the board, and I inscribed it, and I said, thank you very much, and that was my last day at work.
Did they look at you like you were just out of your mind? Did you tell them what you were going to do?
Well, yes, as kind of the time approached, I told them, and yeah, and they were very supportive.
Okay.
And all I can say is I haven't looked back.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
For me it worked. It really did.
You know, you talked about your father, so let's go ahead and talk about him right now because your father, William Gottlieb, famous photographer. Talk about him a little bit.
My dad was quite an extraordinary fellow. He was both a photographer and a writer, but he's best known as a photographer, and particularly known for photographing jazz musicians from 1939 to 1948. And he did among the most iconic pictures in the history of jazz, and is well recognized, not just by me, his proud son, but by everyone in the business, both in the business of jazz and in the business of photography, as perhaps the greatest photographer of jazz musicians who ever lived. And around 1948, he found himself with me as one of his young children, and he actually had 4 at that time, and he needed to make more money than the jazz industry could provide. So he decided to get into the business of educational materials for children, including children's books, and starting at about the age of 4, I became his principal model.
Yes.
So summers, weekends, I was pulled out of school constantly, you know, when we had the big production thing going on, and my mother would tap at the door of, you know, my first grade class, and I'd see her face, and I'd go, I'm getting taken out of school again. Wow. And so I posed for these pictures just year in and year out, and I loved it. And I loved watching my dad work, but we didn't actually talk photography, and he never encouraged me to be a photographer.
No.
In fact, when I told him after 10 years as a lawyer that I was going to be one, you know, he knew that it's a difficult industry, and he thought I was a little bit misguided, shall we say, that I should stay in a business, you know, with good salaries and pension plans and health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I had the bug, so then it was too late. And I should mention that my connection with UDC was I had a wonderful opportunity some months ago to present a little talk about my dad's work, where I didn't really talk about the jazz musicians and their music. I talked about what made his photographs great as portraits of musicians, because they really were exceptional. And UDC was, you know, was very gracious. And then when my book was coming out, I called some of those folks and said, I had a good time talking about my dad. Now maybe I could talk a little bit about my own stuff.
Now, before we move on to your own stuff, those works of your dad, they are now, can be found in the Library of Congress.
So you can go online and plug in Library of Congress and William Gottlieb, and you will find pages and pages. I mean, his entire body of work was donated to the Library of Congress, and it's a vast collection, really definitive of that era. And you will see his work on 350 record album covers, and it fills Ken Burns' series on the history of jazz and so on.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of the photos that we've seen of those jazz icons were taken by your dad.
Yes, and I still have some of his work up in my own studio, and when people come in, they go, oh, Billie Holiday.
Right.
I've seen that before, and they surely have. They're memorable, memorable pictures. He was a real inspiration.